All right, so let's go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning. This is Political Science 1, class number 30620. This is our weekly Zoom meeting. It is Tuesday, the 12th of May, 2020. And today, several things that we're going to accomplish during our 45 minutes together. First thing, in just a couple of minutes, I'll give you a few announcements, reminders to some general things going on with the class that I want to make sure that you are aware of, that you're keeping in mind. After that, I will deal with any questions that you have dealing with the material that you've been working on and learning about over the past week. That is the presidency. And remember, last week during our Zoom meeting last Tuesday, I highlighted some of the important points in the Canvas class notes on the presidency that I posted for you. And hopefully, since that time, you've had a chance to go over those notes in more detail, as well as take a look at the assigned readings for the presidency and the crash course videos on the presidency. And I'll be happy to deal with any questions that you have at that point. Remember, of course, the next assignment that you have due for this class is the discussion forum post on the presidency. That assignment is due on Thursday. That is May 14th at 11:59 p.m. Of course, that does not count the automatic 3-day or 72-hour grace period that applies to all of our assignments in this class during the semester. And then finally, with whatever time we have left, I'll go ahead and highlight some of the key points in the notes for the next section that you'll be working on between this Thursday and next Thursday. And that is talking a little bit about the last of the three national government branches that the framers of the Constitution created, this time in Article 3 of the document. And that is talking a little bit about the judicial branch, the folks who, among other things, are supposed to interpret the laws, tell us what the laws actually mean in practice. So that pretty much is the agenda for this morning. So let me go ahead and begin talking a little bit about some announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. So first of all, if you have not yet turned into me your copy of test number 2, please do so ASAP. And also, please send me an email or a Canvas message. Let me know your situation. Let me know what's going on. Obviously, test number 2 is past due at this point. The grace period is passed, but I still want to give you the opportunity to turn in the assignment to submit if you have not yet done so, that you can get some credit for that. So again, please let me know ASAP if you have not yet submitted test number 2, and we can make arrangements to make sure that it gets done and some points get counted for you. That's the first thing. Second reminder, just in case you haven't been paying too close attention to the calendar for this class of late, we are running out of semester really rather rapidly. Just a few weeks left for us for the spring semester. And in a way, that seems strange. It feels like, especially since we've made the move to a completely online format for this class ever since we've all been sheltering in place. It almost feels like the spring semester has been going on for at least a couple of years. But pretty soon it is going to be completed. And so if you haven't taken a look at the calendar for the class lately, remember that the Students' Choice Project will be due 2 weeks from this Thursday. So basically 16 days from now. So that will be the 28th of Thursday, the 28th of May. So if you haven't started working on the Students' Choice Project, now would be a good time to get going with it. Or if you started working on it but put it aside for a while to concentrate on some other things, now would be a good time to start getting back to it. So again, remember the due date is the 28th of May. That's a Thursday at 11:59 p.m. And of course, plus the 3-day or 72-hour grace period that applies to all of our assignments in this class. So if you haven't yet started working on the project, definitely click on the assignments tab in the left-hand menu on our Canvas class homepage. Scroll down to where it says Students' Choice Project. Click on the link. Take a look at your options. Remember, since the beginning of the semester, when we actually went fully online in this class, I did make some adjustments to the Students' Choice Project. I added a couple options. I dropped the minimum page requirement. And remember, if you were originally doing service learning, the BLAST service learning for this class, obviously that wasn't able to happen this semester. So I have a special deal for you, basically, and this talked about in the assignment guidelines, that if you were planning on doing BLAST and if you completed the training with BLAST, your minimum page requirement for any one of the student's choice project options that you choose is a little bit less, to take into account the effort that you already put out there, taking the training and that sort of thing. So take a look at the guidelines for the project. If you have any questions about that assignment, please feel free to send me an email, send me a Canvas message, or to drop into any of my virtual student hours on Zoom. Remember, those virtual student hours take place every Monday and Wednesday afternoon between 1:30 and 2:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to access the virtual student hours, all you have to do is go to our Canvas class homepage, scroll down past the picture to where it says basic course information, and there you will find both the Zoom link for those weekly virtual student hours, as well as the password that you will need to access those student hours as well. And if you want to talk to me one-on-one via Zoom, but you have conflicts, either class conflicts, work conflicts, whatever it is, so that you can't get to either of those virtual student hours on Monday and Wednesday afternoons, no worries. We can make that work. Just send me an email or a Canvas message, and we can work out a day and time where we can go ahead and meet one-on-one via Zoom and talk about whatever we need to talk about. So let me know. We can work out a day and time, and I'll send you a custom Zoom link and password for our one-on-one meeting. Okay, so that is pretty much all of the announcements and reminders that I had for you. At this point, does anybody have any general questions about anything having to do with the class before we move on and deal with any specific questions that you have about the current subject that we're learning about, which is the presidency? So any general questions about the class at this time, feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or if you'd rather, put your question or comment in the group chat. Either way works just fine. So any general questions at this point before we move on? Okay, so seeing and hearing nothing, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. And if you recall, if you were joined us either live or via recording for our Zoom class meeting last Tuesday morning, you'll recall that we spent the bulk of our time together talking a little bit, kind of giving you some highlights of the class notes from Canvas, dealing with the subject that you have been learning about this week, which is the American presidency. And if you recall last week, there were two main points from the presidency notes that I highlighted for you. The first major point that I really wanted you to take notice of was the fact that while the framers really weren't all that worried about the presidency, the framers themselves, as they were creating the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution, really didn't think that the presidency was ever going to amount to much in terms of being able to take on excessive amounts of power, which could then be abused and used in a way that threatened people's natural rights. The framers just didn't think that that was a likely thing that was going to happen with the presidency. Whereas today, as we talked about last week, most Americans believe that the president is the most powerful and the most dangerous of the three national government branches. So quite a contrast between what the framers thought and what we think now. And so we tried to answer the question last week, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from the framers really not fearing the president to a lot of folks in the US today really fearing the possibility of presidential abuse of power? And the reason is simple. It's the framers' fault, right? Because as we highlighted for you last week, because the framers weren't all that concerned about the abuse of power potential for the president. And we talked about some of the reasons for that last time. The framers really did not sweat the details when they created the structure and function and powers and process of the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution. Remember, we said last week that compared with Article 1 dealing with Congress, Article 2 was pretty short and pretty vague. It didn't have a lot of detail at all. And so, as it says in the notes, and as we highlighted last week, because of that relative lack of detail in Article 2, modern presidents, that is, presidents starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, were able to take advantage of the lack of detail in Article 2 and essentially were able to invent new powers for themselves that the framers really didn't intend for the president to have. And if you've gone through and looked at the class notes on the presidency in detail since last week, you'll notice I give you a couple of examples of these so-called invented powers of the presidency in the last section of the presidency notes, where I go through and in some detail discuss for you the 5 basic functions, the 5 major roles of the president. One of those invented powers that modern presidents have invented for themselves is the executive order, part of the chief executive function of Congress. And then the other major example of an invented power that I talked about later in the presidency notes, part of the chief diplomat role of the president, these things that we call executive agreements. So modern presidents have been able to take advantage of the fact that the framers weren't worried about the president and therefore didn't feel the need to box the president in and very carefully specify what presidents could and could not do. So that's how we got from there to here. That's why today we, as folks living in the United States, perceive presidents as being incredibly powerful, because they are. And it's really kind of interesting. And in a way, it's kind of ironic, even as we speak, the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the U.S. Supreme Court a little bit later on today when we highlight the notes dealing with the courts, which we'll be working on for next week's discussion forum post assignment. But the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. today is hearing oral arguments, that is virtually via Zoom or something like that. They are hearing arguments in a case dealing where they are going to interpret the Constitution and find how much ability the U.S. Congress has to investigate the president of the United States. Remember when we were talking about Congress, remember we were talking about the fact that one of the functions of Congress was the oversight function, right? And that was actually the subject of your discussion forum post assignment dealing with Congress, that Congress has the ability to check up on the president to make sure that the president and the rest of the folks in the executive branch are doing their jobs the way that they're supposed to be doing them. And so the U.S. Congress recently, specifically the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, have been extensively investigating the president, and they are trying to get information specifically on President Trump's financial dealings back when he was running for president in 2016. And specifically, they're trying to figure out, did he receive money directly or indirectly from Russian government officials? And so the ability of Congress to request this information has been challenged by the Trump administration. And so now it's up to the Supreme Court to decide how much power does Congress really have to exercise oversight over the president. So they're hearing the oral arguments right now in Washington, D.C., and in the next few months, we'll be getting a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that is a really significant decision because if the Supreme Court basically says Congress doesn't have a right to access these documents, that decision will dramatically increase the power of the presidency, because it will make it almost impossible for Congress to do its duly noted job of oversight. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. All right. So any questions about anything that I've said, kind of recapping some stuff we said about the presidency last week? Any questions or comments? Please unmute your mic or put a question or a comment in the group chat. Is that all still making sense to us this morning? As I get a quick jolt of caffeine. All right. Not seeing any questions, just want to quickly remind you the other major point that I highlighted from the presidency notes last week has to do with our trying to understand why it is that some presidents in our history under the Constitution, remember we've had 45 of them at this point, why is it that some presidents have been significantly more successful, effective, have been seen as doing a much better job as president than others? Why is it that we have all these presidential rankings that say, well, we have a few really great presidents and a lot of presidents that are kind of mediocre, kind of so-so, you know, not great, not horrible, that sort of thing, and a few presidents that we think were really bad, really ineffective in doing their jobs? What are some of the factors that determine why some presidents in our history have been more successful than others? And we said, of course, there's no one completely determining factor in all of this, but one really important element that seems to have a big impact on helping us understand why some presidents are more effective, more successful, get more things done than others, is the fact that if you look at history, the most successful presidents tend to be the ones that enjoy very high levels of public support. In other words, a large majority of American voters believe that this president is doing a good job, that this president is trying to really represent them well, and they support the president in their efforts. And we talked about the connection between those two things last week. And what I emphasized is the fact that if any president wants to be successful, wants to get things done, wants to advance their agenda, then they really need the support of Congress. They can't do it alone. Because remember, Congress's main job, although it has a lot of jobs, as we've learned already, Congress's main job is to make national government laws. And then it is the president's main job to enforce national government laws once Congress makes them. So really, a president can't be truly successful in advancing their agenda as president without getting a lot of cooperation, a lot of help, a lot of support from Congress. That Congress needs to pass the laws and rules and regulations and government programs that the president wants them to pass. So this makes sense, right? That if a president has a very high percentage of public support, if most Americans support what the president's doing, think that the president is looking out for their interests, that president can use that public popularity as leverage to convince Congress to do what the president wants them to do, even if Congress doesn't like the president all that much. So really, the ability of a president to build and maintain a high level of public support is really crucial to their ultimate success as president. And that was the other main point that we highlighted last time. Any questions or comments about that, or about anything that you have learned about, read about, etc., regarding the presidency over the past week, from the notes, from the assigned readings, or from the crash course videos? Any remaining questions about the presidency or about the presidency discussion forum post assignment that is due, not counting the grace period, of course, Thursday night at 11:59 p.m. So any leftover questions about the presidency at this time? Okay, so seeing and hearing none. Thanks, Dolce, for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and move on. And what we want to do for the remainder of our time together this morning is I want to go ahead and spend some time highlighting for you the next major topic that you're going to be learning about between this coming Thursday and the following Thursday, right? Because remember, after your presidency discussion forum post is done, the next assignment that you will have due in this class, the next discussion forum post, deals with the subject of the federal court system, the U.S. government judiciary, the judicial branch, in other words. And that discussion forum post is going to be due a week from this Thursday, so the 21st of May at 11:59 p.m., not counting the grace period. So yesterday, I went ahead and opened up for you on the modules page for Canvas for our class. I opened up the federal judiciary module, and you will find there a copy of the class notes for the federal court system, which I'm going to go over with you right now and go over some highlights. I also on our modules page, you will find the 3 crash course videos that I want you to watch between now and a week from Thursday, dealing with the federal courts, dealing mainly with the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a few minutes. And also, if you click on the assignment outline and reading schedule, the link at the very top of our Canvas homepage, you will also see that I have given you some assigned reading for the federal court system as well. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of really important highlights in the judiciary notes that I've given you on Canvas. And hopefully, if you are able, you have a copy of those notes in front of you and you can kind of follow along. But here's the thing. Remember, for our discussion of Congress a couple of weeks ago and our discussion of the presidency last week, we started out each of those discussions by helping us understand how we got from there to here, right? Because with both Congress and the presidency, what we discovered is that the framers end up having very different attitudes, very different perceptions, very different understandings about Congress and the president than we ultimately do as folks living in the United States in 2020. And as we talked about both for Congress and the president, how we get from there to here is completely the fault of the framers, right? And guess what? If you take a look at section 1 in your judiciary notes from Canvas, you'll find the exact same situation going on. That the framers, when they were creating the courts, the federal court system, the federal judiciary, in Article 3 of the Constitution, during the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, the framers really weren't worried about the courts at all. The framers believed that the federal courts would be by far the least powerful and the least dangerous of the 3 national government branches. And if you take a look at point capital A under Roman numeral number 1 at the very top of your judiciary notes, you'll see that there are, and point capital B as well, there are a couple of reasons why the framers just weren't worried about the courts, didn't think that the courts would have any potential for abuse of power. And if you take a look at point capital A, it says that the framers really weren't worried about the courts, in part because they knew that the courts had, and note the fancy quote I give you in the bold ink there, that the courts had, quote, neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, unquote. Now you're thinking, okay, wait a minute, that's really strange language. What did the framers mean when they said that the courts had neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, and therefore would never be able to abuse their powers, would never be able to dominate the other 2 branches? Well, that's very quaint 18th century language. That's the way the framers used to actually write and speak. And so let me kind of translate. When the framers said that the courts do not have the power of the purse, what they meant was that the courts do not have control over their own budget. So, in other words, the federal courts are dependent upon another national government branch, specifically Congress. It is up to Congress every year to allocate money to determine the budget that the U.S. federal courts will get to conduct their day-to-day operations. So that's what they mean when they say the courts don't have the power of the purse. They don't have control over their own budget. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, here's the thing. The framers assumed, well, since the courts are dependent on the U.S. Congress to get money allocated to them every year, if the courts ever started to abuse their power, if the courts ever tried to dominate the Congress or the president, all Congress would need to do to shut the courts down, quite literally, would be to yank their budget, to pull the money that the Congress had allocated to the courts back and say, guess what, courts? You don't have any more money to operate, therefore you have to shut down. And that way they could stop the courts in their tracks from abusing their authority. So that's part of the reason why the framers didn't worry about the courts abusing power. But then there's the other piece of it as well. And if you think about it, this kind of all goes back to that whole checks and balances thing that we were talking about at the beginning of the semester. Because not only do the federal courts not have the power of the purse, but according to the framers, they also do not have the power of the sword. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's, again, fancy 18th century language, the way the framers used to speak. And what that means is that the courts do not have the power to enforce their own decisions once they make them. So if a federal court, whether it's the U.S. Supreme Court or one of the circuit courts of appeal or a federal district court or whatever court it is, once a national government court makes a decision, it is not able to force anyone to obey that decision. Instead, that is the job, that is the responsibility of the president, acting as chief executive. Because if you think back to the presidency notes that hopefully you have read through carefully by now, right? And if you look specifically at the chief executive function of Congress, I think that's the second one, the second of the president's 5 functions that I list in that set of notes. We say that the president is ultimately responsible for enforcing all national government, all laws passed by Congress and all national government court decisions. So once a federal court makes a decision, it is up to the president to follow through and enforce that decision, to force people to obey, to do what the court said to do. Now, again, if the courts ever started to abuse their power, all the president would have to do to shut them down is to refuse to enforce their decisions. And there would be nothing the courts could do because the courts can't enforce their own decisions. So you see how this works? Do you see why the framers really weren't worried about the courts abusing power? Because they didn't control their own budget, Congress does, and they can't enforce their own decisions. That's what the president does. So does that make sense? Any questions about anything that we've said about the federal courts so far? And you can either unmute your mic and ask or put a question in the group chat. Is that clear to us so far? Any questions? Okay, great. Thank you very much. So because of that, the framers just didn't fear the courts becoming too powerful. And because the framers didn't fear the courts becoming too powerful, the framers spent almost no time and very little detail in listing the structure and function and powers and process of the courts in Article 3 of the Constitution. If you look at a copy of the Constitution, Article 3, which deals with the federal courts, is barely there. It is extremely short and extremely vague. It is much more brief and more vague even than Article 2, which deals with the presidency. For example, Article 3 says there shall be one U.S. Supreme Court and whatever other courts Congress chooses to create. I mean, that's not a lot of detail. The framers said, okay, so we should specify that there's going to be this one court called the Supreme Court, and chances are in the future, other federal courts are going to be needed, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll just give Congress the power to figure that out at some point in the future. So that just shows you how unconcerned the framers were about the courts becoming too powerful and abusing power. As a matter of fact, the framers were so casual about the court system in Article 3 that they didn't even bother to specify the size of the U.S. Supreme Court. They left that power up to Congress too. So since then and now, it's Congress who decides how many judges sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. And that number has varied over time. Originally, Congress said 6 judges. Why they chose an even number, I have no idea. What do you do if the court ties? If they break a tie by playing, rock, paper, scissors or something like that, who knows? And currently, and for like the last century or more, the U.S. Supreme Court has been set at 9 members, but that's Congress's decision. Again, there's barely any detail in Article 3. The framers just didn't care. Now, why didn't they care? Well, as we've already emphasized this morning, the framers weren't worried about the courts becoming overly powerful, so they didn't see the need to box the courts in the way that they did with Congress in Article 1. But if you look at point capital B under Roman numeral number 1 in your notes, you see the other reason. The other reason why the framers just didn't see a great need to put a lot of detail into the Constitution about what the courts look like, their structure, their function, their powers, and that sort of thing, is that going into the Philadelphia Convention, the framers assumed that the U.S. federal court system would simply be a duplicate, largely a copy of the British court system. And so if that was their assumption, if our courts are just going to follow the British model, we don't need to write down a lot of details into Article 3. Now, stop and think about that assumption for a second, because it should sound a little bit off to you. It should sound a little bit strange and inconsistent to you. Why? Well, think back to the first few weeks of the semester, if you're able. Think back to when we were still meeting face-to-face in the T building, and we were talking about what the framers were doing during the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 when they were creating our current Constitution. And remember how I told you that in most cases, the framers tried to design the new government of the United States under our current Constitution to make this new U.S. government as different from the British governmental model as they possibly could. And remember, at the time, I gave you several examples of that, right? The fact that, our national government is based on separation of powers, whereas the British government then and now is designed in the opposite way based on fusion of powers, right? We also said under our current Constitution, we have federalism. The British government operates under the exact opposite system called a unitary form of government. So I kept giving you examples early on in the semester as to how the framers tried to make our government under our Constitution as different, as distinct as they could from the British government. Why? Because they feared the British government, right? They knew that the British government had too much power. and could easily abuse its authority and take away people's natural rights. That's why the framers, along with the rest of the American colonists, revolted against the British, declared independence, and created an independent United States in 1776, right? So it should seem strange to you at first when I tell you now, towards the end of the semester, that the framers, they didn't worry about the courts. They didn't put a lot of detail about the federal courts into Article 3 because they just assumed that the federal courts would follow the British design. That sounds wrong. That sounds inconsistent, but it's not. See, here's the deal. The British judicial system, the British courts, were actually the only part of the British government that the framers actually trusted. Even back before the Revolution, back when the 13 states were still the 13 British colonies in North America, the American colonists had lots of problems, lots of disagreements, lots of beefs with the British king. And they also had lots of problems and conflicts with the British Parliament. But the American colonists had basically zero conflicts with the British judicial system, with the British court system. Even before the Revolution, American political leaders had a lot of respect for the British courts because that they believed that the British courts did a really good job of treating all British citizens equally and fairly, regardless of whether they lived on the British Isles or in the American colonies or in any other colony that Britain had around the world. So even before the Revolution, American political leaders had a lot of respect for the British court system. And that's why they just assumed that our court system would follow the same design as the British model. Because by the 1780s, the British court system had already been successfully operational for over 700 years. So it had this great track record. So why not? And so that's why the framers didn't bother putting a lot of detail about the courts into Article 3. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Questions, comments, anything like that? Don't be shy. As my dog has a few comments because he always has something to say. Thank you very much. Anyway, all right. So the last point that I want to highlight with you this morning in the last few minutes that we have together today. Yes, I know. He's saying, tell him the last point. Well, I'm trying to. Right. So the last really important highlight from the class notes that I'm trying to emphasize for you is remember, and this I talk a little bit about if you scroll down in your judiciary notes to, let's see, point capital E under 1, right? Remember what I just said a couple of minutes ago. Article 3 is barely there. Article 3 describing the structure and function of the courts is extremely brief and extremely vague. The framers made no attempt to box Congress in. The framers just assumed the courts would never threaten anyone, would never abuse power or do anything like that. Well, remember when we were talking about the presidency last week? And I said, you know, the framers didn't sweat the details with the presidency in Article 2. And because the framers didn't sweat the details with the presidency in Article 2, how modern presidents took advantage and invented new powers for themselves? Well, guess what? A very similar thing happened with the federal courts, but it happened very early on in our history of the Constitution. The federal courts didn't wait till the 1930s to start inventing powers for themselves. They got started in doing this while a number of the framers were still alive. So if you take a look, again, point capital E under section 1 in your judiciary notes. In 1803, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a very famous U.S. Supreme Court decision called Marbury versus Madison, the U.S. Supreme Court invented a massive power for itself that may or may not have been intended by the framers. And the reason why I say this power may or may not have been intended by the framers is because constitutional historians and political scientists and others have been arguing about this really since the 19th century. They're still arguing about it today. Did the framers really intend for the courts to have this big power, and they thought it was so obvious they didn't bother to put it in Article 3? Or were they really not thinking about this? Was this huge invented power not on the radar of the framers during the Philadelphia Convention? We'll never know for sure because the historical evidence is really mixed. It's really unclear. But what is really clear is the fact that this massive power that the courts created for themselves in this Marbury versus Madison case in 1803, even today, continually transforms our life as folks in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about it. The power that I'm talking about is this power called judicial review. Now, you can read through all of Article 3 of the Constitution. You can read through the entire Constitution. Nowhere do you see the phrase judicial review used. It simply isn't there. Now, if you read through the detail in Section E of your notes, I give you a pretty detailed discussion of what judicial review is all about. So I'm going to give you the more brief summarized version here, and you can fill in the details later when you look at the notes. Basically, judicial review is a power that consists of two major elements. The first part of the power of judicial review is the ability of the courts to interpret the actual words of the Constitution. So in this Marbury versus Madison case in 1803, the Supreme Court decided that it is the job of the federal courts, and in the end, it is the job of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. It has final authority on everything, right? That it is the job of the courts to read the actual words of the Constitution, which are sometimes fancy and unclear, or sometimes are vague and unclear. And it is the job of the courts to tell the rest of us, tell Congress, tell the president, tell the American people what those words of the Constitution actually mean in practice. That's what we mean when we say that under judicial review, first of all, the courts interpret the Constitution for us. Now think about it. That first element of judicial review is an absolutely massive power. Why? Well, remember, as we've been saying since the very first day of this class, the Constitution is the basic political and governmental rule book for the United States. Everything that government does in this country is governed by the rules laid out in the Constitution. And in the end, it's the courts, and in the very end, it's the Supreme Court that tell us what those rules actually mean. So this is a massive injection of power for the courts, right? But it gets even better. Then there's the second element of judicial review. Once the courts have interpreted a passage of the Constitution, a particular sentence or a phrase or a paragraph in the Constitution, then the courts can turn around and they can strike down any action by any government in the United States that they believe conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. So if they believe Congress passed a law that contradicts the Constitution, the courts can strike that law down and it's dead, it's gone. If the courts believe that the president has taken an action that contradicts their interpretation of the Constitution, that presidential action is struck down, it's killed. If the courts believe that any of the 50 state governments pass a law or take an action that contradicts their interpretation of the Constitution, that state government action is struck down. It's dead. It's gone. Wow. The courts in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison gave themselves this huge power. And today, everyone accepts that the courts have the ability to do this. Now, what makes this power even bigger and more important and more influential on our day-to-day lives as folks living in the United States is this. In a couple of weeks to end the semester, we're going to talk a little bit about the basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. We're going to talk about two types of freedoms that we have: civil liberties and civil rights. Well, here's a question. How do we know what freedoms we have as folks living in the United States? How do we know what our civil liberties and civil rights consist of? Well, guess what? Spoiler alert. All of our basic freedoms are listed in different parts of the US Constitution. Wait a minute. If all of our basic freedoms are listed in different parts of the Constitution, and if we know the courts have the power of judicial review, what does that mean? What it means is that in the end, it is the courts using judicial review. The courts tell us, the American people, what our freedoms are, what they consist of, how far they extend, and where they are cut off. And guess what? As time goes on, courts change their minds about what our freedoms consist of. Their interpretations of the Constitution change over time. And that's what makes them so massively powerful through judicial review. They basically are able to say what government actions are allowable and which ones are not. And they are also able to tell us what our freedoms are, how far our freedoms extend, and how much government can limit our freedoms under certain circumstances. So that's how we got from there to here, because a lot of people today see the courts as being extremely powerful. Why? Because of judicial review. Because the framers didn't sweat the details when they structured the courts in Article 3 of the Constitution. So any questions, comments, problems, complaints, etc., about what I've just described, this power of judicial review established in 1803? Anybody? All right. So I do apologize for going a few minutes over. Let me just quickly wrap things up and end things up for today. Remember, this Thursday, so the 14th of May at 11:59 p.m., your discussion forum post on the presidency is due, not counting the 3-day or 72-hour grace period, of course. And then your next assignment that is due will be a week from this coming Thursday. That is the 21st of May, and that will be dealing with the judiciary that we just talked about today. So between now and next week, you want to read through the judiciary notes in more detail. You want to take a look at the assigned readings that I've given you on the judiciary, and also look at those 3 crash course videos that I've given you on the judiciary as well in preparation for that. When we come together next Tuesday, same time, same place. Remember, we'll start off, I'll give you announcements, reminders like I always do. I'll then answer any questions that you have about the judiciary and the assignment discussion forum post that'll be due next Thursday. And then we'll talk a little bit, I'll give you some highlights from the notes from the very last section of information that we're going to talk about in this class forever and ever. Hallelujah, hallelujah. civil liberties and civil rights. So remember, if you need to talk to me at any point between now and next week, anytime, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, drop in during my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom, or contact me, make an appointment, and we can set up our own one-on-one Zoom meeting if that's what you need. And remember, when it comes to success in this class or success in getting through the incredible circumstances that we are all living through right now in the US and in the world, remember, you are not alone. I am here for you. I am committed to your success. Always feel free to reach out to me for anything that you think I can assist you with, even if you just need to vent for a few minutes. I'm here for you. So until we next talk, be safe, be well, take care, and remember, you're not alone. I've got your back. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.